For how much? Did you pick a number that would be a share of income, some other variable? What would be the magnitude of your add-on private accounts? And do you have an estimate of how much that might add net to national saving?
Good question. No, I don't have an estimate of how much it would add to national saving. It's something we should work out. I thought something like 5% of payroll, but it might be difficult to get that started at that level. That would be an aim that one would aim for. It might be appropriate to start at more like 2.5%, or 2.5% maybe of payroll from the worker and 2.5% from the employer. One of the points I wanted to make that we didn't raise is that, in a sense, if you have an add-on account where people are contributing, can you say, well, is that really redistributive? In a sense, no, in that if you have a low payroll, if you're not earning much, then you don't contribute as much. But I think the way in which it is redistributive is that you would be providing the infrastructure for low-income people to save. I think one of the reasons that low-income people don't save is that they don't understand financial assets. They don't. If they opened an individual account, the penalties, the amount that would be taken out by whoever's managing that account would be quite large relative to the amount that's being put in, which has been true of in Chile, for example. And so if you were able to provide that infrastructure through the government, I think it would end up being a significant subsidy for low-income workers to save.
Okay. Sorry? Yes, right here, and then over to Steve. And then, yeah, there's a traveling mic. There's also a standing mic in the back. Please identify yourself and then fire away.
Okay, I'm John Turner at the Pension Policy Center. And when you're having add-on accounts, there were two other alternatives. One would be to have carve-out accounts, like was the proposal that you spoke favorably about from President Bush. And the other alternative would be to not have either, but just to have that money go into Social Security and raise the generosity of Social Security. So could you explain why you chose what you did and rejected the other two?
When I was in the administration, I'm sure I've told the story before, I apologize, but when I was in the administration in 2000, Franco Modigliani was a great advocate of investing, actually, the Social Security Trust Fund in equities, called me up to try to persuade me that that was a good idea, and I should try to persuade the administration to do it. And I said to him at the time, this was in 2000, Franco, why should I be persuading the government to invest the trust fund in equities when I'm in the process of taking my own money out of equities because I'm afraid of a stock market crash? I wish I had been so wise in this crash. The idea of having individual accounts is a perceptual issue, whether people think that's a good idea or not. I think one of the things, as Jacob mentioned, we've learned in this crisis is that having the existing Social Security plan, which gives you a guaranteed indexed income when you retire, is a very valuable asset. And so the carve-out proposal, I think, sort of takes away from that, and that's why we're not proposing that one. Then the other side, which is to have the money go into Social Security, I think there is an advantage to the individual accounts in that people can actually see their own money accumulating. We could, after all, make Social Security more generous, and we actually do discuss that in the book. And I don't think there's anything in principle that says we've got exactly the right size for Social Security. Maybe it should be bigger, maybe it should be smaller. But given the sort of political difficulties of kind of raising taxes or raising the size of the program, we felt it might be more feasible to have this voluntary or opt-in, opt-out program, and that people would actually see their money accumulating. Because we did find, as we looked at other countries, that that had been a powerful thing in those countries. When the countries that had converted to individual accounts, there was a good bit of support in those countries for doing that, and people getting the statements like we get our statements from TIA CREF, not that I look at them anymore, but you can actually see your money accumulating. And the reason I told that story in the beginning is that now might be a pretty good time to have a program of individual accounts because hopefully there are some capital gains ahead.
Yes.
You take that.
Hi, Steve Sylvia, American University. I want to talk about the reform that you have, that you've focused on most in this talk, and that is this question of having targeted Social Security benefit reductions for high-income groups. It seems what you propose is extraordinarily complex, and I'd like you to flesh it out a bit more. Is it what you're proposing that you do annual adjustments based on how the high-income earners use that, or how is this going to be linked? Is the linkage going to be done over longer than annual periods? And added to that, it seems very complex and non-transparent. Why didn't you just do what Barry Posen proposed at the tail end of the Bush reform, and that is simply take the two existing bend points in Social Security and just increase the percentage, or increase the percentage decrease that people get at the higher incomes. That would be a much simpler way to reduce what high-income people get while leaving the lower-income people untouched.
Yeah, I think your charge that this is quite a complex way to solve the solvency issue, I think is a point well taken. But I think what we do envision is probably, yes, maybe an annual adjustment. Essentially a linking of IRS records of tax breaks taken directly to what the Social Security Administration has in its databases. So it would require an agglomeration of these two databases. But in terms of finding other ways to cut benefits for the highest income groups, I completely agree that you could increase taxation of them to 100%. You could tweak the benefit formula, as you say, but that would not get us to one of the things that we like to do with the book, which is to take a more holistic approach to retirement income support in the U.S. And we really do feel that it is an issue that you're sort of spending close to $100 billion a year, sort of below the radar screen, towards tax provisions that disproportionately benefit one group. So that's really the addition to the debate about Social Security that we feel this linking directly of tax breaks with benefit provisions accomplishes.
Let me add a quick comment to that. There are two charges or two pushbacks we've gotten on this proposal. One is it would discourage private saving, and the other is that it would be overly complex. And you raise the second of those. In a sense, it would be complex, but I think it could be administered in a way that was relatively transparent, in the sense that people would get a statement at the end of the year when they file their tax return, which would tell them that you have experienced some percentage, 0.5% reduction in your Social Security benefit that you receive because of the tax deduction that you got. So I think it could be made relatively transparent.
Just one additional notion is this issue that is going to, it will clearly reduce the incentive for savings. But we feel that, if you read some of the behavioral literature, behavioral finance literature on these issues, essentially what we're asking people is to, you're going to take a deduction today or this year, while at the same time you're going to forego some kind of benefit in the distant future. And behavioral finance teaches us that actually that trade-off, because of the hyperbolic discounting rates for distant futures, etc., probably leads us to believe that the disincentive to saving that we propose probably won't be as large as many think.
Karen, and then Steve.
Karen Johnson. In your presentation today, you didn't really address in any way the various causes for why Social Security is going to run out of, the trust fund's going to go broke, or the cash flow going into the future. becomes inadequate. And maybe one doesn't need to. Maybe that's not relevant. But one factor that is, at least to my mind, might be relevant is the original hole that was created in Social Security when the very first many years of recipients got benefits whose present value vastly exceeded anything that they contributed. And the fact that we never addressed that hole going forward, we kept just putting it off into the future. And I'm wondering if you think there is any benefit in distinguishing that problem and the financial implications of it from the pure demographic aspect of things, and whether that situation differs for the U.S. from other countries' experience.
I guess. Go ahead. I guess in sense of, I mean, the legacy issue is something that you're going to have it in, and you've seen it across. It's just a natural part of instituting such a system that the people. I mean, we have the example in the book. I forgot the name of the first recipient of monthly benefits who gets she paid in $10 and got $12,000 or something like over the course of her lifetime. But that's that's an issue that it's hard to address, and there's, I don't think that there's much we can do about it. Because at the same time you can make the charge, well, actually those generations that benefited early on from Social Security, well, they might not have gotten the benefit, of public education provision when they were young and things like that. So it's when you talk about this issue of generational distribution, it becomes very complex. So I don't think that that's particularly useful.
Karen, you and I were at MIT together, and I think we probably, we may even have sat in the same class when we learned the exact consumption loan model of Paul Samuelson. Now, I know Peter Diamond made his reputation with some, and Modigliani with variations on that, but basically I think that's past history, and that generation benefited, but that's the generation that went through the Depression or fought in World War II, so I don't feel too bad about that. You said we didn't address in any way the shortfall on the financing side, and I think that's not true. We suggest that there be some increase in taxes. That wasn't particularly the focus of our book or our comparison across countries, but we do talk about that. And then the other is this proposal, which is subject to the criticisms that we just raised for lowering the pension, the benefits received by upper income folks. So some increases in tax revenue and a reduction of benefits for lowering higher income recipients. I want to say too on this proposal, and I realize the criticisms about the complexity and so on, but it really does strike you when you look at across countries the extent to which the U.S. does so much through tax breaks. I mean, it really is a very substantial tax break that you get from deducting pension contributions, and it was made much more generous in the last 8 years than it was prior to that. So, there may be different ways to do this. Maybe it would be better to just reduce the amount that you can set aside for that in a tax preferred form. But that was the sort of issue that we were trying to address.
Martin, given the prevalence of those tax breaks, does it surprise you that U.S. private saving is so low? And what does that tell you about the effectiveness of those tax breaks?
If you look across, number one, we're not saying that those tax breaks are so effective because we're actually suggesting they be scaled back. So I think the evidence is that saving does not go up a lot as a result of those tax breaks and wouldn't go down a lot if you trimmed them back. The second point to mention, though, is that the U.S. is this paradox, at least until recently, where we had a lot more wealth than other countries, even though we had very low savings rates. In the United States, we have a lot of people who save a lot. Actually, high-income people save quite a bit, and they get much better returns, or at least they have historically, than people in other countries. So that's why we have this huge amount of wealth out there. We also have much more access to borrowing, I think, than many other countries, and so that's one of the reasons our saving rate overall is lower. But you know the story of wealth having gone up, and that's why savings has gone down. That may change. We may become a high saving economy.
But just I guess one point to add to that is that a lot of the assets that were in that chart, you know, they would not be part of, you know, household savings rates because they're not owned by households.
Okay, right here, and then there.
I'm Gary Bertlis at the Brookings Institution. I'd like to make one comment and get a reaction. The comment is, John Turner asked whether it made sense to have an individual account system as opposed to just adding it to Social Security, and I think you gave a good answer. Another way to state the answer you gave is, for a lot of people in the United States, it might be a more welcome, politically acceptable, to have what is a voluntary increase in their saving rate as opposed to a mandatory increase in their tax rate. That is a simple way to explain that. The comment I want to elicit is on the this proposal about the tax expenditures. First, I don't know whether you've revised the book compared with the version that I saw, but it struck me that you accepted at face value estimates given by the Treasury and the Joint Tax Committee, and I've called both places, and they both acknowledge that they're vast overstatements of the tax concession that pensions receive. First of all, if you save inside of a tax-preferred pension account, you don't get a lot of the advantages to investing in capital that you get if you save outside. So the true tax concession is actually the difference between the tax benefits you get from saving inside and outside, and those are vastly exaggerated by the calculations. So if you don't have quite so much money to play with as these incentive estimates calculated by the Joint Tax Committee and the U.S. Treasury suggest, where do you find the resources to close the financing gap in the pension system?
Well, the latest CBO numbers on the financing gap suggest that that gap is not so huge. So I think some of these questions are sort of playing into this notion that the thing is broken and is going to collapse. And at some level that's true, but the gap is not that great. And so the difference would presumably come from either raising the payroll tax or raising the limit on the payroll tax or something like that, as folks like Diamond and Orzag suggested in their book. We appreciated the comment that you made on our draft about the fact that we were overstating the tax benefits, and I thought we went back to look at those numbers, and maybe they're still somewhat overstated, but we did try to investigate that. I think we even called those same places, but maybe you got a different answer than we did.
No, I mean, I just to add on that. I mean, yeah, we actually did. I did contact the committees, and the problem. I mean, your point is very well taken. That this is something that they also acknowledged to me that these numbers are, you know, surrounded by a degree of uncertainty, and actually that degree of uncertainty rises exponentially once you go to the OECD level, which we did in the chart. And so your point about the 100, whether we can play with 120 billion or 100 billion, that is well taken. But I think it is true that they are considerable, and they are also far more prevalent in the United States than elsewhere. But we certainly are guilty of, shall we say, you know, running with the available number in a way, the only available number.
Elaine?
Elaine Dent, American Council of Life Insurers. I just had a question. What is your vision as far as the drawdown on the individual account? Will individuals have some access to that money, or will all that money be required to be annuitized?
That's a tough one, and there have been proposals that people should have access to some of this if they're unemployed and they need to go to school or training program or something like that, or want to buy a house or put kids through college. Those arguments are very compelling. I guess when you're, a kid with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Having studied Social Security and perhaps the shortfall of income when people retire, we tended to end up saying we want to try to create more wealth for people in retirement who are, at the moment, probably overly dependent on Social Security. So I think we lean towards not making too much of that money accessible prior to retirement, just so that we can ensure people have it when they retire. But I understand the opposite argument.
But I think and certainly we found that countries that have moved towards this kind of model, for instance, in the UK, New Zealand, Sweden, and the likes, in different shapes or forms, they have certainly gone quite far out of the way to prevent people from accessing it.
Howard?
I have two questions, and they're not really related, but I appreciate your answers. The first one is, it seems to me that back in the Social Security debate, the whole problem with individual accounts was that people feared that it would undermine the political support for Social Security, and number two, that it would be a disincentive for private companies to provide retirement assistance. So first, my first question to you is, how do you deal with that political issue? Because that's always going to be there, and unless we can overcome that, we're not going to move forward with any kind of reform. The second one is on your point about reducing benefits for higher income people. Don't we actually implicitly already do this by taxing it? And isn't the problem that we should, instead of, we take that tax revenue and put it into the general revenue fund, why don't we put that money back into the Social Security Trust Fund? I mean, isn't that the problem? That we're giving it out of the trust fund, and then we're taxing it and putting it back in general revenue.
It actually goes into the hospital insurance fund, a lot of it. It doesn't go to the general fund, but that's a different...
Why? We tax it as income.
Well, okay, well...
Because Medicare is such trouble.
Yes, well, I guess I'll start. About the issue of political support for Social Security, I think your point is well taken, that there was a major concern in 2005. As I said in the presentation, looking at other countries, the concern that simply making Social Security more redistributive in itself is going to undermine support for the program. I don't think there's much support for that notion elsewhere. And of course, you can claim American exceptionalism, but I actually doubt that that's true. Now, having said that, of course, there's also a size issue, meaning that if you reduce Social Security, for a large group of people to a very, very large, very, very small amount. That's clearly, that may well be more of a concern for general, in terms of general political support, but making it more progressive, I don't think is an issue. In terms of, it is a prospect, and we discuss it in the book, that you can increase taxation. As I did, just a factual point. What you are actually doing and have been doing since 1994 is that when you increase taxation levels from 50 to 85%, you actually didn't transfer that money back into Social Security, but you transferred it to to Medicare and Medicaid, because that's obviously where the really big problems are. So that's you could move it to 100%. But again, we feel our reform proposals with this direct link to the uses of tax breaks has the benefit of tying those into the general debate, which typically is not the case, because tax breaks are not, they sort of under the radar screen in many ways.
Steve?
Can I just make a quick comment, because you mentioned that it might undermine private provisions. I don't agree with that. I think one of the things that you would do by having individual accounts would be you would pool the money, and then it would be put out to be managed by licensed private asset management funds. You wouldn't have the government actually managing the money, so it would be like the federal retirement program. So I think the money management community would actually welcome something like this. Now, they didn't like the Bush plan too much, because that administration was trying to get them to manage the funds and handle the administrative paperwork, all for about 30 basis points. And the fund managers said we can't do that. The administrative costs are too high. But if you do all the managing of the individual accounts through the Social Security Administration and just have the money itself pooled and managed, I think you could get it down to around 30 basis points.
Excuse me, Martin, that actually wasn't my question. My question was, if there are a lot of alternatives, then private companies will not provide retirement assistance to their workers. They'll just opt out and say, well, the government's providing you all these things, we don't have to do it anymore.
Okay, I concede that, but remember this is designed for lower income folks and who are currently not getting pensions.
Okay, Steve and Thelma, and that'll be the last questions.
A question about the 1983 reforms, which you said were a great accomplishment and ahead of the curve compared to European experience. And yet, the political bitterness surrounding those reforms is what is in part impeding the current proposals, not just yours but others. Talk of looting Social Security, as you referenced in that article in The Nation. What can be done, or first of all, what can be done to explain to people why the 83 reforms didn't produce the long-term stability for the system that was promised, and what can be done to assure people that your reforms will be successful where those may have failed?
Several points. I mean, it's certainly true that the 1983 reform was early relative to many European countries, but in terms of the funding shortfall facing Social Security at the time, it was obviously in the nick of time. Given that the trust fund was going to run out of money, I believe 6 or 8 months after that reform was actually enacted. So you clearly needed that crisis to get it done, which is sort of ominous, considering that if you imply the same reform process to the current situation, we won't get a reform until 2040, which of course would be very bad. But in terms of, I don't think it was never. The socialists, as I understand it, and I should plead here that I wasn't part of that debate in '83, but as I understand it, it was never intended to solve it for the long term. I mean, it was only intended to do 2/3 of it, or 70%, or basically kick the can down the road for about 25 years. But one of the things that we do propose, and this is why we want to address the really long-term issues, is that one of the ways you can do this in a transparent manner is direct life expectancy linkages, because this is one of those long-term trends that's going to continue and is obviously one of the underlying trends for why Social Security is still not long-term in a long-term solvency.
Let me make one last comment, if I may. First of all, in response to Karen Johnson's earlier comment, we did propose continued increases in retirement age, so that's another provision that would help on the budget side. I think the purpose of this project was to look at what other countries do and learn some of the lessons. And if you look at the book, there is a series of things that we say we've learned from what we saw in other countries. And so the main purpose really is to inform the debate, which I think is going to be a bitter one. I'm not sure I'm going to fall on my sword on the particular adjustment of high income benefits that we propose. We wanted to make a set of proposals coming out of this, but really whether you agree with that proposal or not, I think there's some good lessons from what other countries have done that we hope will inform this debate. It will be a bitter debate, but it's a debate that's going to happen. I mean, and it's going to happen at some point. We've got, obviously, the Medicare express train coming down the tracks, and I think at some point we're going to have to embrace Social Security. So we hope this was a timely contribution to saying, here's what other countries have done, here are some of the lessons from that.
Your final question, Thelma Askey.
Thanks. I might just make a brief comment on American exceptionalism. I think perhaps there's more to that than you might think. I'm just doing my pre-OECD days, because in the U.S., Social Security, which was one of the reasons it's so politically difficult, is in the U.S. it's seen as an earned benefit, whereas in the rest of the world it's looked at as part of the social safety net that the government is providing mainly. So I would just throw that out there for further thought on American exceptionalism with respect to Social Security. But what I wanted to ask or make note of was the percentage of fees that are charged for managing these accounts, because one of the things that the OECD study looked at was the variety of these fees and where the U.S. fits in the rest of the OECD countries is that because it has a lot of choices, it means that the amount under management is smaller and the fees are often higher. And the push is to reduce that so that you have more under management and lower fees, because a 2% fee can result in over a 30% reduction in benefits over time. So how...
Yeah, that's...
Yes, and you alluded to that. So how can you address that a little bit? This is another choice. It's going to be managed by the private sector. Anyway, I'm just raising that issue.
Well, in the federal retirement program, at least when I was contributing to it, you had a limited range of choices of plans you could participate in, and I think that would be true of what we're proposing in the add-on accounts. So you wouldn't have such a wide range of choice. And no Madoff, hopefully. We didn't actually find evidence from other countries that people had made very rash choices, but certainly having a huge range of choices tends to increase the fees. And that's a crucial point, I think, to reiterate again, is that these fees tend to eat up the contributions. And if you look at the famous Chilean system, the reason that it's done relatively well, and there are critics now of that system, but the reason it's done very well is the rates of return were extremely high. And so the fees, even though the fees were large, you still got pretty good rates of return. But if you're talking about relatively low, at least reasonably secure assets are going to have relatively low rates of return, then the fees, as you correctly say, are going to be crucial. And that's why we think it is an effective subsidy to low-wage workers if you pool the money and get it managed outside.
Okay, many thanks to Martin and Jacob. Again, many thanks to Kalolo, our friends at the Ford Foundation, for inspiring the project. Thanks to all of you for coming. Meeting adjourned. That was very good.